Hello, greetings. The question today is, why is King David called a man after God's own heart? Let's turn our Bibles to the book of Acts, chapter 13, and see the very verse that talks about this. Acts chapter 13, verse 22. After removing Saul, he made David the king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. Well, there you have it. It says that God's going to have a new king in place of Saul. And he says, he is a man after my own heart. And it says that he will do everything I want him to do. But so the question is, David, a man after God's own heart? But was David pure? Was he righteous? Was he blameless that he is called a man after God's own heart? Well, the answer would be no. David was not righteous, right? David was, in the sense, he was not pure. Okay, he did sin, and we all know that he committed adultery. Or was it that God was not sure that David would sin? Didn't God know it? Isn't God sovereign? Doesn't he know everything? And didn't God have an idea that David is going to sin in the future? Of course. God does know. God did know. So, coming back to the question, why would God call King David a man after my own heart? What made David special? What was it? What was it? Something that the Bible calls him as he's after God's own heart. Well, let's find out the answer. And so let's go to the book of 2 Samuel chapter 11. It is there we will encounter the passage. And first let's see the sins that David committed, or what happened. How did his downfall come about? Let's read from verses 2 to 5. One evening, David got up from the bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from a monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, I am pregnant. So we see that David committed adultery, and the woman Bathsheba, she became pregnant. Well, if we read further, David calls Uriah and wanted him to go home, calls him back from the battle and wants him to go home and spend time with his wife. But Uriah was a righteous soldier, and he didn't want to go sleep at home when his men were out waging war. So he refuses, and we read in verse 14 and 15, 2 Samuel 11, 14 and 15. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down and die. And that's what happened. All right, because Uriah wouldn't listen. He even got Uriah drunk. But that's what happened. He says, send Uriah up in the front. And Uriah goes, he fights, he dies. He's killed. And 2 Samuel chapter 11, the last verse, the final verse ends this way. After time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, that is Bathsheba. And she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Okay, so what David had done was bad. He had sinned. Now, I believe that the key in understanding what it means to have to have a heart the way God has, or how to understand the phrase a man after God's own heart, we need to go to chapter 12, 2 Samuel chapter 12, and we read from verses 13 to 23. And I believe that's where we have the whole essence of what made David so special. So let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 12, and let's take it part by part and understand this. 2 Samuel chapter 12, we are in verses 13 to 23. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13. So what's happening? We have Nathan, a prophet, who comes up and confronts David. And when Nathan confronts David, and David understands that he is guilty, I want us to focus on David's response. Verse 13. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Many years ago, I'd done a sermon, and I'd spoken about how various people talked about how they had sinned. Now, for example, we have in Exodus chapter 9, verse 27, we have Pharaoh, who makes the same statement, I have sinned. He tells that to Moses. You go to Numbers 22, we have Balaam. He says the same thing, I have sinned. But in Joshua chapter 7, we have Achan. He says the same thing, I have sinned, when he was caught. And King Saul says the same thing in 1 Samuel 15. He says to Samuel, I have sinned. What's unique about I remember one more thing, Judas. Judas says the same thing in I think Matthew 27. He says, I have sinned. And what makes David so different? Because David says the same thing, I have sinned. And what makes it different for David is David goes, I have sinned against the Lord. You see, when it's not about David being a man after God's own heart, does not mean that he was blameless and he had not committed any sin. It doesn't mean that. What it meant was when he did something wrong, when he sinned, David saw himself as, it's against God that I have sinned. It's against God that I have sinned. And so it's not I sinned against Bathsheba. I sinned against Joab, and I sinned against Uriah. No, I sinned against the Lord. And I think this is what is so important. We all sin. But if we don't see that as my sin is a sin against God, then we would just be like Pharaoh or Balaam or Achan or Judas. Not understanding how my sin affects God, how my sin spoils the relationship with God, how my sin tarnishes the image of God. And so David had this attitude. When he was confronted, he goes, hey, you know what? I messed it up. And I messed it up first and foremost against God. I think that's a great clue to look at why David had the heart of God, a man after God's own heart. Well, let's read from 13 all the way to 23, and then let's extract some more insights from it. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You're not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had born to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the night lying in sackcloth on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. Verse 18. On the seventh day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. David noticed that his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied. He is dead. Then David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house, and at his request they served him food, and he ate. His attendants asked him, "Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, and now that the child is dead, you get up and eat." Well, let's pause for a moment, and let's see if we can, let's glean out some insights. You see, so the first thing was, David understood he had sinned against God. The second thing we say is in verse 16. You see, it says, David pleaded with God for the child. Amazing attitude. You see, David knew that he had sinned. But then after that, his focus was, God, okay, I messed up. I want my son to be saved. Please don't take away my son. Knowing that God's punishment is just and that God would do what he would do. But knowing all these things, David just pleads for his son. A good question to ask ourselves is, do we plead? You see, David didn't plead for himself and he kept saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. His focus was on his son. I think that's a great lesson to learn over here. You know, when we sin, sometimes we become so self-focused, so much about, into ourselves and what people would think, rather than thinking, hey, I need to save someone over here. Let me go to God and beg God for his soul. And that's what David did. He pleaded for his son. A good question to ask ourselves, when was the last time we pleaded for someone else? For someone else's life? You see, when you start doing that, you start getting the heart of God. All right, verse 16. It says, David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground. The third thing we see is David fasted. Again, not for himself, but for his son, for someone else. And I think that's, again, a good thing to ask yourself, when was the last time I fasted? Not for my heart to change, but for someone else's life. Wow. You see, now we get to understand how David, why it is called, or why it is stated in the Bible that he was a man after God's own heart. Another thing we notice over here is the child is dead. He discovers that. And once he discovers that, he was ready to kind of, face the punishment. He took the punishment squarely, and he took responsibility. Why do I say that? You don't see David complaining. You don't see David grumbling or murmuring. Or you don't see David having bad attitude towards God. You don't see David saying, whining away and, what's the use of coming to you and praying and fasting when you can't listen to a simple prayer? I sinned. This wrong thing happened. You don't see David do any of that. Nothing of that at all. There's no bitterness in David's heart. Nothing. No bitterness towards God and towards the way God is taking is giving him his, what is due to David. You don't find David saying, forgive me all the time. Nothing. Or why didn't you forgive me? Or why didn't you just, let the sin go? You don't see any of that. A fifth thing we notice is it says David changed. In verse 20, it says he got up, washed himself, put on lotions, changed the clothes, and he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. David, had a full bath, all set, ready, new clothes, lotions on. He goes to worship God. And I was like, wow. No more He's not even focused on, oh, this bad thing happened. No, he goes, you know what? Time to go back to God with a different attitude. He was with God all the time. He was. He was with God all the time. He's been pleading and begging God, fasting. But once he finds out his son is dead, now there's a whole change of attitude. He goes, puts on, has a wash, puts on new clothes, lotions, everything, and he goes back to God again, worshiping him. Wow. Wow. I mean, he just spent time with God. Yeah, he changes and he spends it. I believe David just not washes his body, but also washes his mind and gets a new mindset saying that back to God again. Back to God again. And he worships God. I think David, we pray and we'll see that coming up, how David's prayer was something. Then after something happened in his life, his son died, David goes back to prayer again, but this time is totally different. Let's see what happens. Let's catch it up. So, we'll read verses 21 to 23. His attendants asked him, why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat? He answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. What an awesome attitude. David, lastly, the sixth point is, and the final point is, David reasoned and moved on. David reasoned and moved on. And after this tragedy, it was not about, okay, let me go about and tell my sad story to other people, and what will Nathan think about me, and what will people think? Oh, so Samuel, don't write it down. Oh, please, don't put it down in the Bible. Everybody will read about my sin. He's not interested at all. He's not interested about that. He's not bothered about that. David knew he had to begin fresh. He had to begin new. He had to start all over again. And the first place he goes, the first place to begin with, the first man to talk to, the first encounter had to be with God. That's the first person. That's what comes to mind. So there's a tragedy that takes place. Oh, death. He goes, time to go back to God again and start with God. After all that happened, David goes, I had to begin with God. I think now we get the understanding of why the Bible states that David was a man after God's own heart. Because see, David imitated the right thing to be done that God would do. And I think he sets as an example, when we do something wrong, when we sin, our heart needs to be, all right, I mess it up. I sinned against God. Let me go back to God and start all over again. What a way to emulate God's heart. What a way to reflect and show people and help people to understand this is how God is. This is who God is. And so no wonder David is called a man after God's own heart. It was not the wars he won, and he won many wars and battles. It was not the way he led the people, of course he did. But it was, he knew that when he fell, or when he falls down, he knew one thing. When I get up, I don't get up and run, but I should get up and run first to God and then move forward and take God's discipline as this is God's love. Thank you so much. I hope that answered your question, but why David is called a man after God's own heart.